Hello, in this video I want to end off the conversations that we've been having talking about Moten intellectual property protections. I think that this has been a really good set of conversations because we got to talk about a lot of the ways that I think Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's work really directly fit under a particular type of resolution like intellectual property protections, that I think a lot of the things that they're talking about in terms of how we think about study and professionalization of like study and all of those things kind of fit into one resolution. And I also think that a lot of times people have really, I guess, like undervalued, I think, a lot of the critiques that Moten is making about like governance and the international field. And I definitely think that this like full kind of conversation that we've been having has been a really good opportunity to talk about like what are the possibilities of this and its ability to kind of create like a various amount of like generative strategies for kind of all sides of the debate. And so I'm hoping that this video will definitely be a good way to finish it off as we talk about and kind of finalize out how to answer affirmatives that are reading Moten on the intellectual properties protections topic. If this is the first video you're watching, I would definitely go back and at least watch the video right before this that starts off this just talking about like how you should understand your priorities versus people that are reading Moten on the affirmative on this type of resolution. And then I also would definitely suggest looking back at some of the stuff that I've kind of talked about in terms of the intro to Moten and IPP that definitely lays out the basis of what I think some of these arguments will look like, because I think all of that kind of context is definitely helpful to understand how we get to the point where we're ending off here. And I think having the really coherent story on how this kind of like full lecture has kind of come across different time periods can be very, very helpful. In this last video, I'm going to just talk a little bit about how I think you should kind of be answering this affirmatives if you want to read a criticism versus whether you want to use a counterplan and disad strategy, both of which I think are viable avenues for how you can answer these types of affirmatives like intellectual property protections resolution, because I think there are different grounds for how contestable methods can think about a different way of like theorizing how we resist against like this structure internationally. But I also think there is a good set of like impact tournament debates to be had when you kind of open up counterplans and disads as optimal kind of neg options to use as well. And so I definitely want to talk through all those options in this particular video. In the criticism kind of set of like what you could be doing against this type of affirmative, I think some of the best arguments that most criticisms make against Moten on this type of topic is really a question of like what this looks like at a praxis level. I think a lot of the arguments that Moten kind of makes in relationship to praxis are arguments about why sociology and our relationship to how we think about the social sphere kind of predetermines what type of like relationship that we have to institutions, movements, etc. And I think all of that is definitely a fair kind of ground for them to stand up on. But I also think there's a really good set of arguments to be made about why that doesn't mean that we shouldn't lose kind of the value of some of the power of the institutional nature for how things like different types of vertical organizing looks like, and also kind of what it looks like to assume that there can kind of be this traversal of the differences between different types of like social locations and different types of historical capacities in relationship to what like international relationship looks like. You know, we're on the WTO kind of like mechanism for this type of resolution, and so I definitely think it opens up a broad spectrum of how you could talk about how different kind of like racialized groups kind of respond to violence and when that violence is kind of premised off of historically, and how that creates barriers to the ability to kind of resolve a lot of the arguments that I think this criticism is kind of like, that I think that the affirmative is really kind of like mostly trying to assume that it can kind of like not fiat over, but definitely kind of assuage over with a kind of mutual commitment to resistance. And I think there are so many good examples of how that breaks down internationally. If you trace down even between like the breakdowns between the Black Panther Party and their meetings with Mao, or other kind of like international scenes where different groups that are trying to resist ultimately end up excluding other marginalized groups, kind of like mimicking different types of colonial apparatuses, etc. I think it really complicates a lot of the praxis questions that I think that Moten teams maybe take a little bit for granted when they're reading affirmatives like this. And I definitely think regardless of what criticism you're reading, I feel like that's the place where I would really start to dig into this type of affirmative and really start to try to make framing arguments based off of like how their actual understanding of what study should look like can like lead to a set of practices that relate internationally. Because I definitely think that when you kind of like lend a different historical complexity to what can kind of be analyzed by just like domestic American based examples, there become a lot of different like complexities to how we think about like what it means to be like morally in the right direction, or what it means to be mutually committed to getting rid of the way in which we think about like sovereign capacity and anti-blackness in the status quo. And I definitely think that there are a lot of ways in which you can kind of harness a lot of arguments to make about why a different type of way of thinking about how we should organize, whether that be the complete refusal of like identity categories as a whole, whether it be a question of just like understanding the necessity of kind of like vertical organizing and the way in which vertical movements create a net easier way for us to think about like international cooperation, etc. All of which I think are really good considerations to kind of throw out against it's an affirmative like this, and I definitely think it's a place where you want to situate both how you're explaining and doing the judging instruction for what types of arguments that the judge should be valuing, while also thinking about what types of criticisms that you can derive as kind of your link arguments that make it a little bit harder for them to access the permutation, and that set like really harsh lines between like what is the difference between your model organizing and theirs, which is I think the place where you kind of like really need to be in order to set up a lot of the like really good offense that comes from reading an argument like this. I think that then when we transition some of that advice into what like more counterplan and disad strategy looks like, I think there are so many obviously core disads to make about why the idea of abolishing things like the intellectual property protections field, which I feel like is the place where you want to push most of these affirmatives to stance their ground, is like I think there are a lot of arguments to be made about how that, you know, trashes the economy, trashes our access to medicine and resources, particularly for this types of resolution, and the way it kind of like destabilizes a lot of the way in which the international order stops things like the largest atrocities from happening, global warfare, etc., and why the breakdown of these organizations and the status quo doesn't actually allow us to have a kind of rapid response that is comparable with the affirmative. I feel like if you set up a really strong uniqueness argument that's just like these things are working to correct themselves now, and the 1AC full abolition of intellectual property protection as a field completely destabilizes like the international order and the way that we think about like international economies and access to medicine, I feel like your kind of like impact turn for the affirmative when you're thinking about like that kind of like disad or counterplan can really make a bunch of arguments about how not only that kind of lends itself to a lot of the kind of like existential crises that a lot of, you know, disads want to go for in terms of causing extinction, etc., but also why that creates like reduced access for those that already are kind of like lacking access in places like these. And I think that that is kind of where you want to put a lot of your work into how the disad seeps into the affirmative, and I think you can put a lot of impact defense and terminal defense into your argument by winning that a lot of the arguments that they want to go for in terms of how we should be morally relating to questions like the disad ultimately don't answer the questions about like the way in which various types of populations are disturbed by the ways in which the economy rises, falls, collapses, etc., and the way that those things predetermine how access is kind of served to various types of like communities around the world, and how the affirmatives like inability to resolve those things faster makes it like a lot more certain that either the status quo or a competitive counterplan can be able to resolve the affirmative a lot better. And I think that that opens you up to have like a lot of interesting scenarios and a lot of interesting net benefits for whatever type of advocacy that you want to end up with. Hopefully this video was helpful, and hopefully this entire series was helpful for allowing you to think about how you should be considering Moten and answering Moten arguments on the intellectual property protections topic. And hopefully it'll be a really good set of months for this type of resolution to have a really rich debate on this. Yeah, thanks.